Okay, hi all, welcome to my first part of my mixing tutorial. We're going to be trying to mix this track here, the Everything You Need task. We're going to start off by talking about the drums and then how to mix all the various elements together to make a more polished track within Sonar, looking at the effects and the way that we can use and process sound within Sonar. Okay, so first things first, you need to make sure that your track is ready to mix. So that means that you've edited all the parts, so it's all in time, it's all neat, and so you can see here we've got all our parts and they're all where they should be and everything's in time. We've cut off any of the kind of pops and glitches or anything that's at the start or end of the track that we don't need. So this is, you've got the track as you want to mix it, as you'd want it to be heard. Okay, the next thing to take into account is the genre of music you're mixing, and make sure you familiarise yourself with the track that you're mixing in, the genre that you're trying to aim for, because that will affect some of your mixing decisions about whether you mix the kick and the snare higher in the mix or not. So yeah, here we go. Let's start by looking at the drums. So I'm just going to select a part of the track where they've got a drum beat, and just going to put that on loop using Sonar, and just going to solo them. You have to remember now that whenever you play the drums and whenever you're trying to mix them, you have to reference it back to your mix. It's really important that you listen back with all the other parts and make sure our frequencies clashing. Is the kick drum and the bass, can you hear both of them as separate instruments, or is one drowning the other out? Anyway, let's have a little listen to how our drums sound at the moment. Okay, so it's fairly clean recording there, and we can pick up more detail in a second, but we're currently in the track view of Sonar, but once we start mixing, we want to move into the mixer view. Now you can find that by going to, or the console view, which if you go to the view bar at the top in Sonar, you can go to view console, and that will bring up your console view, and you'll see that you've got various different options there, and you can actually drag this up, so we can get rid of that top bit now because we know that we just want to focus on the detail down here. Okay, so there's a number of other things that we can see on this channel strip that we can't see in the track view. So we can see that we've got a kind of primitive EQ control there. We've got an effects bin, so that's where we're going to be inserting our effects. We can do sends, and I'll talk a bit more about sends in another tutorial. We've got the mute and the solo, and the panning, and we've also got all of our faders, and we can see that we've labelled our tracks here, so that's quite helpful. Okay, so the kick's going to be the kick and the snare are going to be the most important parts of the kit that we need to mix. So we should probably listen to the kick by itself just for a bit and just have a real detailed listen to the sound. Okay, we can hear some bleed from the other drums, but that's absolutely fine. That's absolutely normal. We can, if we listen to that kick drum again, you can hear a thud, but you can also hear a little rattle, which is just a problem there with the recording process. So we'd want to make sure that we tighten any of those screws or bolts when we're recording the kick drum. But it's not a bad start. It's a nice clean sound. So what we can do is we can put in an EQ using this effects bin here. Now, I'll just load in an EQ. So if you go to audio effects, so if you right click in that box, go to audio effects, so Anitas effects and equalizer, that will give you your EQ control. And this is what we can use to change the frequencies in the sound. So if I just play the kick drum, I'll give you an example of what an equalizer can do. So I'm going to raise this up and you'll hear the bass frequencies rise up. Okay, there we go. We can hear the bass is clearly kind of the bass frequencies. The volume of the bass frequencies is getting turned up and then getting turned down with this control here. So there's a number of different things we can do to kind of boost and cut frequencies within a sound, because mixing a track is much like baking a cake in that you want to add certain elements in, but you don't want to keep all of them. So for the kick drum, we want to have a nice thud in there. We want to make sure that we can hear the kick drum in the mix, so we might put a bit of the slap from where the beater hits the skin of the kick drum, but then we don't really want any other frequencies. And similarly with the bass guitar, we might decide how we want to mix that in. So we want the bass frequencies of the bass guitar, but we don't want some of the higher frequencies, which might be fret buzz or fret noise. Okay, so good practice with the kick drum is to boost around 80 hertz. Now we've got different types of boost controls on an equalizer, and you can see here we've got six different controls that we can turn up and turn down, and you can see that the various options. So I'll just talk you through those options before we do it. So we've got the band type that we're on, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6, and then you've got the filter type. So we've got peak, dip, shelving low, shelving high, low pass and high pass. Now I'll just go through these just for anyone that's never used EQ before. A peak or dip is also sometimes called a notch filter. If I select that one, so if we forget about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for a minute, we just concentrate on 1. As you can see, as I lift it up, it creates a peak or a notch, or if you went down, it would be a dip in the frequency of the sound. And so if I just press play on that kick drum, I'm turning the peak up there and the notch down, and we can hear the bass frequencies getting turned up and turned down. Okay, so that's what this control means here, the frequency. So that's in hertz. Obviously it goes from kind of 20, well, it goes from 16 hertz, but 20 hertz is the normal human hearing range, and it should go all the way up to about 20,000 hertz, just over 20,000 hertz, which is the human hearing again. Okay, so we can boost and cut these low and high frequencies. This Q control is how thin this kind of hill is, so we can ramp up that Q, and it makes a much smaller, much more narrow Q, what we call narrow Q. And if I press play, you'll actually hear it, that if we get too close, it starts to sound a bit like a sine tone. Quite an obvious effect there, but obviously that's got its uses in electronic music, but we don't really want that in our kind of rock or pop production, so we're going to keep that Q fairly broad there. And we're going to boost around 80 hertz, because that's where the thud of a kick drum is. There's a frequency control chart up in E106 as it currently stands, and so you do have a look at that. It's got a frequency chart. I'll probably add that onto the end of this tutorial. And so let's just play this here. Okay, so I'm going to use this bypass control. Okay, that's okay. So that's sounding a bit more thuddy. We could probably do with some more of the high end there, but as it stands, it sounds good. We need to make sure that we're not peaking the equalizer here by turning the gain up too much, because if we turn that up too much, you'll see this goes red, the track goes red, and the output goes red, and that has an adverse effect on the actual final mix. It will peak, it will clip, it will distort, and it will sound horrible. Even if it sounds okay at low level in your headphones, it definitely won't when it's played for a CD player in someone's car, for instance. Okay, so we've boosted up around 80 hertz. If we also put in another peak filter, we put this around 2,500 hertz. I'm just going to type that in there. You can double click and type it in. That gives us a bit of the slap. This kick drum wasn't particularly well recorded, unfortunately, but this is the kind of EQ that you'd be looking to do on a normal kick drum recorded in the studio. Okay, so we've got a bit of a thud there and a bit of a slap, and that'll do us for now. We can tweak that as necessary later. The next thing we want to do then is listen to the snare. So let's have a listen to that and see if we can EQ that one a bit. Okay, so as you can hear, there's a lot more spill on that as the microphone's a lot closer to all the other instruments, and you've got the hi-hat and the ride there. So we're going to put in another equalizer on this one. And so this time we're going to approach it from a slightly different angle, where that we can hear. We know that a snare drum has a bit of a punch in the low end, and that's generally around 100 hertz. If we have a little listen to that, so let's play that, and I'll just bring that Q down a little bit. Okay, if I just pause there. Around 300 hertz, you've got quite a boxy frequency. So if I just bring up the 300 hertz here, just get rid of the 2 for a second. I'm just going to rise that 3 up. That's what I like to call the boxy frequency. It sounds a bit like a box. If we bring that out, maybe lower the Q a bit, we get a much tighter sound, and we lose that kind of boxiness. I'll just bring that boxiness back in. Okay, so it sounds a bit more slappy, a bit more punchy, and if we put that 2 back in, that should give us a bit of a punch on the low end. Okay, that's not too bad for starters. So if we put those in, and then what I'll do then is I'll just solo all those drums again, and now we just want to try and get a mix between the cymbals and all the different the different parts of the kit. Obviously, our tom tracks here are just going to be spilled from the microphones unless there's a fill. There's not too many fills in this track, so I'm just gonna turn these down for now. And we've also got the one overhead here, so this was a mono recorded overhead rather than a stereo. So I can just also bring that down ever so slightly because the cymbals will cut through the mix very sharp. Okay, that's quite a nice drum sound. It's quite clear, quite clean. We can hear all the different elements. We can hear the kick and the snare loudest in there, and the hi-hats also coming through. If we wanted to adjust the EQ on that overhead for whatever reason, if we decided that we wanted more high frequencies, then you'd be looking to use a shelf rather than a peak or notch filter. Now a shelf, if I show you what that looks like, just get rid of all the others, turn these all off again. So a shelf high does exactly what it says. It kind of creates a shelf, so rather than kind of boosting everything above that, it just raises everything above that point, above that hertz ever so slightly. We can also lower it to turn them down. Now that's really useful because sometimes we don't want to get rid of all the high frequencies, or sorry, we don't want to boost all the high frequencies in such a way where it's kind of exponentially going up and being very very tinny indeed, or vice versa. We don't want to get all of those high frequencies out of the sound. We just want to turn the high frequencies down a bit. That's when you'd use a shelf. If you had a high-pitched unwanted frequency that was kind of up in this band, then you'd use a low-pass filter. So a low-pass filter means that it only lets low frequencies pass through. And as you can see, we've actually turned that curve's gone completely to the bottom, so none of these frequencies would go through that filter. Let's just play that and see what that sounds like. I'll just unsolo these. Okay, and as I raise that up, you'll hear all the high frequencies coming back. Okay, and so we might want to put in a high shelf. Let's see if I can get that number back. There we go. Just to boost some of those high frequencies, just to get a bit more brightness out of the cymbals. Just breathes ever so slightly a bit of life into that. Okay, so we'll keep that. Of course, if you had 2 overheads, you must make sure you pan them left and right. We've only got 1, so we can't pan that either or. Okay, so if we listen to them all back together again, just quickly. Okay, good. So at this stage, we can see that we're not peaking the master at all, so that's quite a good level. Obviously, as you add in more and more instruments, they're going to be at a louder volume, and they'll come together and they'll cause the master to peak and distort, so you must keep an eye on that. A handy tip actually is if you click and hold and drag across on that bottom there, so they all go blue. If you hold control on your keyboard, I'm holding control on the keyboard, and then you click, you'll see that you've got an orange set of orange squares, and that means that they're all going to move in ratio. So if I take my hand off control and click and drag, you can see that it's just going to do 1, whereas if I hold control, it will do all of them at the same time, kind of in ratio there. So if we know that we've got a good mix for our drums, but we want to just turn them all down ever so slightly, we could just do that. We could do it that way. Or alternatively, I'm going to show you another method, which means that we're going to put these all out to a bus. Now this is really important because it can be really helpful in music to be able to put things out to buses so you can control them all with one fader and process them all in the same way in terms of using maybe reverb or other EQ. So to do that, there's a couple of ways that we're going to do it, and I'll talk through a couple of ways in this tutorial. But just to start us off, I'll click on modules. I'm going to click in and out, and then you'll see at the bottom you've now got the inputs and outputs. Now, we normally, all of the audio tracks output to the master bus here, and then that outputs itself to the sound card, but we're going to create a new place to output to. So once again, if you hold control on the keyboard, once you press this, so it does them all at the same time, we're going to control, and we're going to put in a new stereo bus. Now, a bus is just like a bus where it transports people in life. A bus can transport audio, so we're going to put all of our drums into one bus, and then that bus will go through to the master. So do that again. So make sure they've all selected, hold control, new stereo bus, and you can see that they've all outputted to bus C, which is our new bus over here. Now I'm going to double click on that and label it because it's really important so we understand, so we can remember when we come back to our mix. And now if I press play, we can see that our drum bus here is taking all the audio. So I'm just going to unmute those a minute, unsolo those, sorry, and then put this on solo. Good. Okay, so then we can balance that into our mix. So we know that we've got a nice mix here, and then we can hear it all together there. Now, a couple of other things we can do using more advanced mixing techniques and more advanced processing techniques. It's really good practice to put on a compressor on both the kick and the snare there, just to give them a bit more punch, because a compressor squeezes the dynamic range. So if you've got a very soft sound, if you've got something like a kick drum where you want to squeeze the top part, the loudest part of that sound, with this kind of the softer parts of the sound, so it has a much thicker body, we'd use compression. So I'll show you what that looks like. If we go to audio effects, go to Sonitas and compressor. So here we've got a number of different controls, but the main ones we want to focus on right now are the input threshold. So the threshold here, and that can be controlled using here. And I'm just going to play the kick drum just so we get an idea about what's going on here. So we've got the sound going in, and then we can turn that threshold down, and so any sound that's above that threshold will be compressed, or will be turned down. Now that sounds a bit counterintuitive. Why would we want to turn down our kick drum if we want to make it louder? But what we're doing is we're kind of squashing the louder dynamics and then bringing everything back up using this gain control here. So if I just show you what I mean by that. So we're squeezing the sound, and then we're going to bring it back up using the gain control here. You can see that it's kind of ever so slightly peaking the master there. It's probably due to some of our EQs being quite aggressive. Okay, so you should hear, now I've got it on bypass, you should be able to hear a fuller sound. We can even bring that threshold down more. Okay, so that's okay. That's not too bad. It's given us quite a nice thud and punch there. There is a good preset. I don't generally encourage using presets. You should always make sure that you're tweaking the controls to exactly how you want them. But if we just put a kick drum in, as you can see, it's changed the shape of this curve, so it's much more aggressive. So as soon as the sound gets so loud, it's going to get squashed very, very quickly. Okay, let's have a listen. And just bring that gain up. I'm just going to bring this back up to normal gain. Okay, going to squeeze it even more. Okay, so it's rounded off that sound a lot more. It's thickened it ever so slightly. And you'll see it will have a big impact. Now, it's really important that you don't over compress the sound, so don't bring that threshold down too much, because you'll get something that sounds a bit like this. Which sounds very, very odd, because look at the amount of gain reduction that's happening there. Okay, so we can bring that back up, turn the gain down. Remember not to turn the makeup gain up so loud that it starts peaking and distorting. Okay, I'm just going to leave that there for a second. We can also do a very similar thing with the snare. Now, if I want to copy across an effect, if I click and hold, I can drag it across. But if I hold control down on the keyboard again, the CTRL bottom left-hand corner, so if I unclick that and I hold control on the keyboard, now drag it across, you'll see that there's now a plus sign on the mouse here. And so that will mean that it makes a copy of that effect. So we could also use a very harsh compression on the snare drum, and let's see what that sounds like. It's giving us a thicker sound, but what it could do is a bit more slap. It doesn't seem to have any slap through the mix, and I think that'll be reflected when we listen to everything back together. It doesn't quite feel punchy enough. Certainly not as punchy as our kick drum there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a copy of that snare drum. I'm going to clone that track. I'll do it in the track view. Show you what I mean, because I want to actually process the snare in two different ways. So I'm going to make an exact replica of that track. So in Sonar, if I click on that track, click on the snare track here, right click, and I'm going to click clone. It's going to ask you what you want to do, but generally leave those things ticked. Then we've got two copies. So if I call this one snare, and I'm going to call it gated because that's the processing effect we're going to use. Okay, so now we've got two snare drums down here, and obviously you can see that it's still outputting to the right bus. So I'm just going to put like that. And so if we had them both on solo, we had them together, it's just going to make it twice as loud. Okay, so we're not doing anything to the sound there, just apart from kind of doubling it, which isn't very helpful, because you can imagine if you just kept doubling all the tracks until you heard them in the mix, that's not the best way to go about processing. Okay, so I'll keep that equalizer there for a minute. Get rid of the compressor just for now, and you can turn them on and off by clicking on what looks like the little power icon, and when it's in grey it means they're turned off. A little top tip: if you've accidentally turned off all your plugins, that you can do that with the E button on the keyboard. So I'm going to press E. As you can see, we've got they all grey themselves out, so sometimes that can happen. We can also bypass them by using that button there. Okay, so I'm going to process this snare drum using a gate. So I'm going to go to Sonitus Effects and use the gate. Now this one, again, like compression, has a threshold, but this time it will only let a sound through if it's above a certain threshold. So let's have a look at that in action. Ooh, I've snapped that in there. As you can see, that's now snapped onto the bottom bar. If you want to unsnap it, you can just drag it off there. Okay, let's have a listen. Okay, watch what happens as I drag up this threshold. We'll stop hearing the sound. Okay, so we've set the threshold so high so it's only going to let those snare hits through. And now we can process that snare hit to give us a bit more punch. And if we can press that even more so. We might even put a bit of high frequency on that. High frequency boost. Okay, so we're going to, obviously by itself, that sounds really weird because you wouldn't expect to hear something to kind of chop in and chop out. But when you want to get that punch, that gate's really good for that. So if we put everything else back in our mix, I'm going to have to mix the snare down again just because of the fact that we've got two there. Okay, good, much punchier there, and giving us a really nice sound. So we've got the kick, the snare gated, toms and our overhead there. Okay, so if we're going down to our drum bus, then we can mix them all in. Now the last thing I'm going to show you about the drums, because the drums are generally the most complicated bit to try and mix and process, but there's a couple of tricks and tips we can use along the way. So as well as doing everything that we're doing here, we can also use a send. So what a send means is we can send it to a separate bus. So we're outputting to two places, which can get quite confusing. So at the moment, all of these drum tracks are going into our drum bus, but we might also want to put all of these tracks into another bus, and I'll show you how to do that. So I'm going to hold control, and hopefully I'll be able to create a send here, and then we're going to create a new Before I do that, I must make sure I've selected everything at the bottom, otherwise it'll only do one track. So I've highlighted all of those in blue. Now I'm holding control on the keyboard, inserting a send, and into a new stereo bus. And so you can see they've all gone now to bus D. and bus D's here. So I'm just going to put in drum compression. This is a little tip that I picked up from a studio producer familiar with working with Biffy Clyro and those kind of rock acts. There's an old piece of equipment, an old compressor, which is now really highly sought after, called the 1176, and that gives us a really interesting effect when we compress. When you used to push all the buttons in on the controls to kind of, it would make it glitch and have this really interesting effect. And they've emulated that inside the compression. So we've got music, we've got vintage, but inside music, if you go to Drum Destroyer, you'll see that you've got a very, very hard ratio there and a very hard knee, so it just kind of flatlines. And if we listen to what that effect that has on the whole kit, ooh, let's just solo that bus. Okay, I'm dragging the threshold right down. It sounds really weird on its own, but if you put that in back into the mix, with this drum here, we can blend them in together and it can give it much more body and much more presence. Let's have a listen. Okay, we're getting much more body and presence, but notice how we're peaking and distorting the output, so we must make sure that we reset those peaks and just turn everything down ever so slightly. Okay, and that's given us a really nice basic drum sound there. In the next tutorial I'll start talking about the bass and all the other instruments, but the drums are the hardest thing to get right, and sometimes it can be quite frustrating because you always need to go back, and you'll notice in my next tutorials I'll be going back, I'll be changing the EQs on the kick and the snare, but you do need to get that rough mix, that rough balance there.